Doomsday. I'm Kendall Bryan Hunter, author of the book Consider My Servant Job, and this is Come Follow Me, Get to the Point, where I always show up, I always come prepared, we never take roll, and it's bring your own refreshments. Today it's kefir. It's nice probiotic yogurt. So, no, I'm not going to throw it. I don't want it to splash around. So, Doomsday. Uh, Joseph Smith Matthew. That chapter begins with 5 questions. And here's the questions. The first one is found in verse 2. They ask about Christ said that the not one stone will be left on another of the building of the temple. And so that's the first question that the apostles had is, what about the building of the temple? And then in verse 4, it has the remaining 4 questions of the 5. So they asked about the destruction of the temple, the destruction of the Jews, the sign of his coming, and also the end of the world, which it means the destruction of the wicked, not the destruction of the globe or the sphere of the earth, but the destruction of the wicked. And it was also confirmed in in the Joseph Smith manual on page 299. So here's the answer that Christ gives: is the answer to the first 2 questions come in verses 12 through 21, and then for the second 2 questions, those come in verses 21 through 55. And also, as you read the Joseph Smith translation to Luke 21, 24 through 25, or verses 20 through 25, that talks about the shift in the thing. So he's answering these questions in one discourse, and sometimes as we read it, we think all of it deals with is just sort of answering the same question about the second coming. That's not true. It's Christ's death and the destruction, but also with the second coming. So there's like 5 questions being answered in this one talk, so it's a little bit complex. You have to pay attention to how Christ answers it and what's going on. So one of the things that gets discussed in this section is the abomination of desolation. Nice, juicy word. So what an abomination means in the scriptures, it means, first of all, generally a bad thing. It also can refer to a false practice. And in Deuteronomy 7, verse 25, an abomination refers to a false idol. That they had some problems with false idols, Baal and Ashtaroth being worshipped. And an abomination would be something about a false idol. It's a kind of an interesting question. It's fun researching what the scriptures have to say and what some of the brethren have to say about the abomination of desolation. It is one of the signs of the time, but something to think about. As you read in the Book of Mormon, they talk about the great and abominable church of the devil. And I think that's something tied with the abomination of desolation. So we don't have enough information about it, but as it comes closer to Doomsday, the prophets will certainly get revelation about it and how to guide us through that, the abomination of desolation. Another thing brought up in this chapter of Joseph Smith Matthew is false everything. False Christ, false prophets. The Book of Mormon talks about false churches, and that's in Words of Mormon. The book we kind of skip over sometimes. It's one chapter, but verses 15 and 16, King Benjamin had to worry about false Christ, false prophets, and also in 2 Nephi verse 26, and also 4th Nephi chapter 1 verse 26. If I didn't do a typo, Nephi discusses false churches, and these are all things that go together. You have the false Christ being taught about by false prophets, and you have false teachers operating in false churches. And it's something to pay attention to, because that's where a lot of people get deceived. So just 2 comments about this. 3 is, don't get caught up with a formal understanding of church. Think about pundits, podcasters, and also how chatbots will factor into all this. Chatbot can be a false prophet as much as anything else. But our pundits, there are thought leaders and influencers, are they also false prophets, although we wouldn't consider them prophets in the kind of the normal sense of the word. So Elder Bruce R. McConkie talked about sort of these things coming under the heading of a false system of worship, doing things that lead you astray from the correct way to worship. And that's important. There are certain rules to worship, and God wants ordinances done in a certain way, as you read in section 132 and also section 22. You need to do the ordinances properly, and you need to understand who you worship. And it's not a sort of open source Hyde Park open mic night, even though sometimes testimony meeting can get that way, where some of the stuff gets fairly off the wall. But that's not how things should work, and that's why you read about in 3rd Nephi 11, where Christ needs to clear up some of the false doctrine among the Nephites. He has to do it personally. But another thing to think about too is President Eldon Tanner, in the conference report to October 1966. This is the priesthood session. He warned about that we can become false prophets to ourselves. Think about that, false prophets to ourselves, where we're just kind of deceiving ourselves, lying to ourselves in denial. And so we teach false stuff to ourselves. That's an interesting insight. It's not a false prophet or a false Christ, it's someone that's outside of us. We can be our own false Christ and false prophet. So, this is get to the point. Let's move on a little bit. Matthew 25. So, think about this, is Matthew 25 has 3 parables: the wise and the foolish virgins, the parable of the talents, and the parable of the sheep and goats. And we sometimes study these things out of context, but these are actually doomsday parables. They're parables preparing us for the second coming. And I think that helps resolve some of the concern we have about with the wise and foolish virgins. The normal complaint is these wise virgins were mean, the virgins weren't sharing their oil, and you need to share a caring person. But think about that in terms of doomsday. Certainly it's a warning against freeloading. You hear people say, well, I'm going to sort of latch onto this person who has food storage and he'll be a good Christian. And it's like, no, you're freeloading. And you need to take care of yourself and stop expecting other people to take care of you. Because ultimately when doomsday happens, when the second coming happens, you just can't do it. Time's up. The same thing too about talents and bearing your talent and not using your talents wisely. Also about the sheep and goats and services. But keep it in mind that these are parables to prepare us for the second coming, and they're not just sort of standalone good ideas. They're in the context of the second coming. This is get to the point, and that's what I wanted to cover. So let's go to the Christ quotient. This will be a little bit longer. So the first point is, yes, Christ is coming. And secondly, what he's doing is Christ is warning us about what's going on. Section 1, verse 17, it says, "Wherefore, I, the Lord, knowing the calamity which had come upon the earth, upon the inhabitants of the earth, called upon my servant Joseph Smith, Jr., and spake unto him from heaven, and gave him commandments." So how to prepare for the calamities, follow the prophets, and keep the commandments. And there are horrific things going on in the last days. This is what Joseph Smith saw a vision of it, and he alluded. You can read a little bit about this vision that Joseph Smith alluded to in Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith. I'll source that when I post in the notes. But this is how Jedediah M. Grant remembered Joseph Smith telling us. The prophet Joseph Smith stood on his own house when he told us several of us of the night the visions of heaven were opened to him, in which he saw the American continent drenched in blood. And he saw nation rising up against nation. He also saw the fathers shed the blood of the son, and the son the blood of the father, the mother put to death her daughter, and the daughter the mother. And natural affection forsook the hearts of the wicked. For he saw that the Spirit of God should be withdrawn from the inhabitants of the earth, in consequence of which there should be blood upon the face of the whole earth, except among the people of the Most High. The prophet gazed upon this scene, his vision presented, until his heart sickened, and he besought the Lord to close it up again. So let's be serious. Yeah, there are difficult things, but there's safety in following the prophets and studying the scriptures. Studying the scriptures is how you will not be deceived by false Christs and false prophets or false pundits or false influencers or false chatbots. So another thing to think about too is preparation, the wise and foolish version. How are you preparing for the second coming? Are you doing the temporal preparation, and are you doing the spiritual preparation for the second coming? Another thing to think about is the principle of proportionality. The widow's mite and the parable of the talents is that some things aren't distributed evenly, but if you're given the short end of the stick or a small talent, you're supposed to use it as wisely as possible. As the widow with her widow's mite and the man who was just given one talent, he could have used it better, as Christ said, just put it in the bank and collect interest off the money. But keep the proportions to account, like with tithing. So another thing to think about too is, what's your personal game plan for dealing with false Christ, false prophets, false teachers, and false churches? False pundits, false influencers, false podcasters, false chatbots. Look up the expression chatbot hallucination. You need to come up with a game plan. What are you doing to prepare yourself to be insulated and to fight against the peer pressure when a lot of people are following false prophets and false Christ? Lastly, so this is a very negative podcast, but I just want you to think about this in conclusion. This is from section 6, verse 34. Wherefore, fear not, little flock, do good. Let earth and hell combine against you. For if you are built upon my rock, they cannot prevail. Think about that. Feel that. Christ is the consistency in the chaos, and that's the point.